Hello everybody and welcome to the EV Charging Podcast, a brand new series taking you behind the scenes of the electric vehicle charging industry in Australia and around the world. I'm Daniel Carson.
And I'm Jeff Sykes.
And we're your hosts from Solar Choice, Australia's largest independent quote comparison platform for electric vehicle chargers, solar, heat pumps and batteries.
Over the course of this 10-part series, we're going to bring you interviews from the people who have helped shape the EV charging industry into what it is today, and who are hard at work building out the products and services that will facilitate this monumental energy and vehicle transition in Australia over the next decade. You'll be hearing interviews with founders like Brendan Wheeler from EVSE, EVNEX's Ed Harvey, and CEOs like EV Network's Paul Fox, as well as energy engineers, policymakers, and more.
So if you're a budding entrepreneur who wants to hear about other founders' experiences, or you work in the energy industry, maybe you're a sustainability nerd, or perhaps you're just thinking about purchasing your first EV and a charger. If any of those sound like you, you're in the right place. This is the very first episode of the series, and we're so excited to share an interview we recorded last year on the sidelines of All Energy Conference in Melbourne, Australia. We sat down with Tim Washington, the co-founder and CEO of JetCharge, and Tim was kind enough to take us on a trip down memory lane, sharing how JetCharge went from an idea for a local installation company and grew into one of the leaders in the Australian industry. Tim also gave us some really candid takes on what grinds his gears and how the argument for environmentalism in EV charging doesn't necessarily add up, but doesn't necessarily matter either. And so, here's our interview with Tim Washington. We are joined today by Tim Washington, co-founder and CEO of JetCharge, co-founder as well of ChargeFox. He's a Melbourne local where we're recording today. And Tim's really dedicated a lot of his life to working in roles and businesses that have helped move the needle for EV charging in Australia. So we're really excited to have you here.
Good to be here.
Welcome.
Maybe we start out at the very beginning. I think your early stages of your career, you were a lawyer.
I was. And I don't know, lawyer brings up all kinds of feelings in people. So I was the evil kind. So I worked for large corporations and made sure that they got their deals through and their contracts through. My last transaction actually was the sale of ExxonMobil's retail petrol assets to 7-Eleven. And funny story, my co-founder, Ellen Liang, was actually on the other side of that deal.
Wow.
And we didn't know that for pretty much 6 months, where we would both be working very long hours. We both wouldn't tell each other what it was. And then we both ended up not being busy at exactly the same time. And we turned to each other and we said, were you on this deal?
It sounds like something out of a sitcom.
It actually was. I used to be a lawyer and I was very passionate about the law. And I actually wanted to be a constitutional lawyer and went down the wrong path, chased the money. And I think that's kind of taught me a lot of lessons, but also has just been awesome training. Because I think one thing they don't tell you about business is if you start going to the enterprise space in particular, just how many large documents hit your desk. And one of the good things about being a lawyer is that you're not scared of large documents. So I wouldn't have traded it for anything. But yes, I started out my career in the law.
It's an interesting starting path for an entrepreneur. My experience of corporate lawyers is, previously working at the Commonwealth Bank in strategy roles, they will often come in at the end of strategy design pieces and basically railroad or put up red tape or hamper innovation. So it seems you've broken the mold and gone the other way.
When I was a lawyer, I would have said, well, we're controlling risk. But I think, we have quite a few lawyers in the business. And I think the thing we're always trying to do is making sure we don't do stupid crap. I think that's like number one.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I can see why you say that. I'd like to think there's another role, but yeah.
I think maybe going down the dark side did you a favour if you'd ended up in constitutional law and you'd satisfied the ethical drive in yourself. You may not have ended up where you are now.
Absolutely, yeah. Life takes many turns, and all kinds of things would have happened. But I'm really happy with the path that we're on now.
So how did you jump from law to EV charging? What was the bridge?
I didn't actually. So I jumped from law into a family business, and my mum, very old school, kind of like capitalist story, the type of story that you tell in, classrooms that teach why capitalism is good. And because my mum came here as a migrant, didn't speak any English, worked her ass off from an outworker all the way through to building a pretty successful import-export business, and over the course of 35 years. And it's the kind of story where they hold it up and go, see, anyone can make it. And so she asked me to join the family business because she wanted to retire, and we did clothing manufacturing. And so that was the bridge. And from there, I learned about production, ran a couple of factories in China. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that we obviously deal with Chinese suppliers now in the current business, and just having an understanding of how factory environments work, how production works. It's amazing what empathy can put on the table. I think, if I kind of cut on a slight tangent, I think there is a tendency for quote unquote customers, whether they be residential customers or commercial customers, who forget about empathy when dealing with suppliers, and forgetting that actually we're all just people trying to do our best. And I think it is amazing what happens when you start working with your suppliers as true partners and, probably more important, human beings. Yeah. So anyway, I got that from the family business, and did that for 5 years before making the jump to charging.
So 11 years ago, you started Jet Charge. Can you give us an idea of what that looks like? I mean, there was hardly any EVs on the road. A lot of people must have been wondering what you were doing starting an EV charging business. But I think, the people have come to realise that this industry has enormous growth that's probably inevitable. It's just a case of how quickly the transition is going to take place. So obviously you were one of the early adopters of that viewpoint, but what did it look like at day one?
So it actually came out of me wanting to strike out on my own from the family business. So clothing's an incredibly hard industry, and there's no value capture. It's purely based on price. So it's both a glamorous and incredibly cruel industry. And so I really wanted to get out of that and do something on my own. And I really settled on tech because I'm a old school geek, the kind of like computer games at lunchtime kind of kid. And I really like cars. I enjoy driving them. I like looking at them. And then Ellen, my co-founder, is the one who said, I'm going to be supporting our family for at least a year. So we have to do something that's net good. And back then, actually, I was not a climate denier by any stretch of the imagination, but it wasn't energy transition and climate action wasn't in my top 5 list of priorities. My priority was to kind of like make a living and build some wealth. But with Ellen's prompt, I kind of said, all right, so we don't need another mattress company. We need to do something that's net good. And I started looking at electric mobility because back then Tesla had they had the Roadster, but they were just about to launch the Model S. And I started looking at it and I said to Ellen, I was like, hey, I think electric cars will be a thing. And Tesla's building a really cool brand. And she said, okay, cool. And what do you want to do? Do you want to build an electric car? I was like, no, I can't build an electric car. I said, but I think there is a service required for the charging. And back then, something in my gut said that charging was going to be a very big deal. And the reason I thought that was because Tesla were advertising that you charge at home. And I thought to myself, hang on, so you charge at home and you never have to go to a petrol station. And I didn't know it at the time. With all the knowledge that I have now, I would have known that was a very big deal. Back then, it was more of a gut feeling that something was about to change. And the other reason I really wanted to pursue electric cars was actually first principles. So I am still of the view, like I'm not a climate warrior, really. If you think about that kind of typical climate warrior, I'm not one of them. I believe in first principles that people will buy what's best value for them. And when I was looking at all the research on batteries and the declining cost of lithium batteries and where they were forecasting it to go, and I was looking at how EVs inherently have less parts than internal combustion engine vehicles, I said to myself, so what we're saying essentially is that structurally, EVs will be cheaper once they hit mass market. And so then I said, okay, well, if EVs are going to be cheaper structurally, then it has to take off. And yes, there's government incentive to like boost its adoption, but eventually, if something is just going to be cheaper and better value for the vast majority of people, then that's what's going to win. And so that's why we started EV charging. And we didn't have, like, Jet Charge does a lot of things today, but we didn't have that ambition to be who we are today. And in fact, I would say, looking back at my journey when I first started, I would have told myself 11, 12 years ago that why would you even start a business when the vision is that small? Because all we wanted to do was to have a specialist electrical installation service for EV chargers in residential premises in Melbourne. That's all we wanted. Not even general electrical work. So like our vision was actually smaller than a general electrician, right? And so I was sitting there going like, why would we even do that? But that's how we started.
Well, it must have been convincing enough, especially the conversation between you and Ellen, your partner, because
Yes.
you went on to go all in on it together, right?
Yeah, and like I think her attitude was, because we had saved enough from the family business, which, you know, was successful enough where we made enough money where I could go a whole year without taking a wage, right? There's not many people who can do that. Like that's a huge luxury. And so I have this philosophy where we all have our dreams in life. And often the reason we don't take them is because of financial stress. You know, you want to provide for your family and you want to have food to eat. So I was in this really privileged position where I didn't have to take a wage. And I basically said to myself, all right, I'm going to chase this. And if it doesn't work out, the world always, rightly or wrongly, needs more lawyers. And I think it's that protection in the back end that, you know, allowed me to go harder. I ended up not taking a wage for 8 years.
Wow.
And in pursuit of the dream. And so Ellen supported us throughout that entire period. And I actually get quite emotional when I think about it because, you know, like business is a very hard journey with a lot of sacrifice. And I think the sacrifice that Ellen went through to support us, I'm very grateful. So yeah, but this is not a sob story. It was great. Like it's worked out well. But that's how we started.
It's like you said, a privileged position to be in, but not everyone who's in that position. And there are lots of people in Australia who might be relatively well off and have the opportunity to take a leap like that, but not all of them do. And I think at that time, you know, it was a small business. We all know the numbers on small businesses and the rate of failure. Yeah. It's easy to look back now and say it's not a small business, it's a successful big business. But back then, in 8 years of not taking a salary is a really big commitment to the vision of what you could become or what the company could become.
Yeah, but I think it was that belief that really kept us in there and seeing the numbers slowly tick up. But it was still hard, you know, like from 2012 to 2020, there were no government subsidies for vehicles or charging, no government programs. And that was pretty tough.
Was there a point along the journey, like a year or a moment when you felt, okay, we're well positioned, this is going to work out, we're going to be a successful company?
No, definitely not. I still don't feel that today. I don't feel that. I actually, and whether that's manufactured or whether that's a genuine feeling of instability, I don't know. But I do know that in a fast evolving landscape, the moment you feel like that, you've already lost. That's my view. And we're constantly evolving ourselves. So, you know, as we said before, we're at All Energy, and I have the confidence to know that 95% of the people who are involved in the EV charging industry on those stands are about to go through what Jet Charge has gone through for the past 5 years. And the business models will be the business models that we created and did. And that by the time they get to a stage where we are today, we are hopefully have executed well enough to have moved on from that. And it is that, I think, drive that keeps me very unsteady, but I think it's necessary.
So you've played a pretty interesting role beyond Jet Charge in terms of the inception and your role with the Electric Vehicle Council. How do you reflect on your role and what's their role in the Australian market as well?
I mean, obviously, I have a very soft spot for the EV Council, being one of the founding members and chair. But the way I think about it is this, right? There are different types of businesses that have different strategies to chase different outcomes. I know that sounds like really generic and obvious, but I'll give you a simple example. There are, and I'm sure being Solar Choice, you can name many companies who are subsidy chasers.
Sure.
Right? And I think obviously people have their kind of views of those companies, but it is not an illegitimate business tactic. So the government creates a subsidy. It is designed to increase adoption of something. Of course, there are going to be more people who go into that space to capture it. But there are businesses whose sole focus and founders whose sole focus is to do that. When you're a business like that, and many have done very well, extremely well, right? So when your sole focus is that, there is no point in engaging with the industry because you know your lifespan and your wealth creation as a business will be 3 years, 2 years, 4 years, right? So what's the point of doing things like the EV Council? The way we approach business at JetCharge and the way I personally approach the industry is that if your time horizon is not 2 years, but 200 years, and I know that sounds really stupid, but is long term, then what happens in any given year is less important than the trend of the industry. And we knew that if we were the only ones, and our head of future business, Christian, has been saying this for a long time, if you're the only ones doing something, that is a hard road. That's a hard road. So every given year, it matters less. What matters is that the industry grows and that we hopefully can still lead a much bigger industry. EV Council, I knew from day one, we really needed something like this because the electric vehicle world is different. And so the reason I do all of this engagement and work on the EV Council and do all the stuff that I do is simply because I know that without an industry, we're all screwed. And if you go to All Energy today, you can see the impact that not just EV Council, lots of other kind of organisations have had in lifting the narrative around EV charging beyond what it otherwise would have been. And I actively say to people, we need more players in the market. Now, obviously, as a business person, I want to make sure that when those players enter the market, we're already way ahead.
Sure.
So there is a bit where you hope, oh, God, not another competitor. But I think the reality is that, you need more players in the market to drive outcomes. So EV Council has basically been behind every single program designed to increase electrification in Australia. And I couldn't be prouder of kind of what we've achieved. And Behad, who's the CEO, and me as the chair, we kind of handed over the reins pretty much at the same time to the next group, as it should be. It will always hold a very fond memory in my heart, and we still engage, obviously, very closely.
Sure. Maybe let's go back to JetCharge and talk about the fruits of that hard work then, because you said when it started off, you had pretty small ambitions that have obviously evolved over time. And now JetCharge is spread across pretty much every aspect of EV charging. Is there one that's the main focus or a main growth area, or is it just all systems go at the moment?
I think for me, if you look at the graph of EV adoption and everyone talks about, when are we going to get to the hockey stick? When are we going to get to the hockey stick? I think we're still on the flat part of that graph. Mm-hmm. But what that graph doesn't tell you is that flat part is an average of different parts of the EV charging world, and that it is not flat for all industries. So what I mean by that is everyone thinks about passenger vehicles when it comes to EV charging, but actually everything's electrifying. And so you've got apartments, commercial buildings, trucks, vans, buses, all of that stuff, right? Mining, yeah. And so in a market that's growing, it is actually not consistent among each one of those, right? And so JetCharge built to who we are today out of necessity. So people think, why are you tackling everything, Tim? Why don't you just focus on one thing? I say, well, to be honest, because from 2012 to 2020, if we didn't tackle every bloody thing there was out there, we would not have survived. Like, we actually wouldn't have survived because there weren't enough opportunities. So it is a matter of history and legacy. And one of the reasons I'm so grateful for like this country and our ability to grow in this country is that we've been left alone. Obviously now there's a lot of competitors and a lot of players, but we were left alone for too long. It allowed us and gave us time to build expertise in every part of the value chain. Whereas if we were in Europe, China, or parts of the US, we would have been forced to specialize very early on. But I think the reason behind some of the good outcomes we've been able to deliver is because we are now experts in every part of the value chain. And so one, that's history. Two, it's hedging. So I can tell you, in a market that has seen a slowing of growth in the passenger vehicle segment, if your entire business relies on passenger vehicle sales, you're stuffed. Quite literally, you're stuffed. But JetCharge will grow again very aggressively this year and do well this year because we tackle other parts of the market. But I think ultimately where we're heading as a business is we've got a very firm strategy within the company. 70% of what we do as a business is not public, as in we're not known for that. Mm-hmm. Most people know us as installers. The irony being we don't do any installation. We partner with electricians,
Right.
But they go, oh, JetCharge, they do the installation. No, we don't. We partner with electricians and they know us as hardware distributors. But actually almost all of our future growth and strategy has very little to do with that. Really, ultimately, the end goal is to think about JetCharge's role on where the value and opportunity is created at the convergence of energy and transport. When vehicles act as dual assets for both transport and electricity, I think there is a significant role that JetCharge can play in that future. So we're building towards that.
That's interesting. And one aspect that perhaps goes a bit behind the scenes is the transition of commercial fleets, which to the people who care about climate change is a particular exciting opportunity, because if we think about decarbonising transport, passenger vehicles often sit in a garage for 95% of their life, whereas the commercial fleets, bus depots, things like that, often have a much higher road time in terms of use. So where do you think the industry's at in terms of getting these fleets of vehicles across to electric? Because we don't really see that many electric buses. We don't see that many electric vans on the road today. So does the business case not stack up yet? Or what are some of the roadblocks that we need to dive over?
When you talk to people in the EV charging industry, most will gloss over the business case part of it. I don't believe in forcing anything. So again, this is a long-term mentality. I know it'll be cheaper, but there is no doubt that if you go out and buy an electric fleet or lease an electric fleet even today, it's going to be more expensive. But the gap is closing, and closing hard, right? So in terms of a business case, there are now commercial drivers, let's just say Uber drivers, who will come out on top if they have an electric vehicle. There are transport companies with specific routes in metro that will come out on top today. But can you go buy an electric truck or an electric van for cheaper than a diesel truck or diesel van? No, of course you can't, right? But if you look at the total cost of ownership, for some fleets, it already stacks up. For others, it's very close. And I know that in the next 2 to 3 years, it'll 100% cross over. And again, it's inevitable because electricity is much cheaper than petrol or diesel, especially when you manage it right. When you've got the right tariff structures, when you've got the right charging profiles, you've got solar battery, you've got all of these things, right? And so the second thing I would say is that we are inherently visual creatures. And so I think it is fair enough when you say, I don't see many electric buses, I don't see many electric vans. But I can give you as many statistics as you want as to how many more electric buses there are this year than there were last year, or how many more electric vans and trucks there were this year compared to last year. There's a lot more. But being visual creatures, it's almost you need to get to Model 3-esque type of penetration, Model Y, before people go, hey, there's a lot of electric. But the good thing about our business and the interesting thing about our business is that by the time that you've seen that on the road, that has confirmed to you that the era of electric commercial fleets have arrived, we've already been putting the infrastructure in and planning for the infrastructure for probably 3 to 5 years. Because obviously the depots need to be electrified, the homes of the drivers need to be electrified, and then they can actually put the electric fleets in. I'm incredibly optimistic for the fleet sector, the truck sector, and the bus sector. Because in a world where running costs is the number one driver of the bottom line for a lot of these companies, as soon as the costs are cheaper, they'll switch en masse. They have to, because the margins are too small, right? We talk about the margins of solar and battery companies. Holy crap, if you look at the margins of freight companies, geez, that's a hard business. So as soon as they can eke more value out of that, they will. Right? So I'm very optimistic. And on buses in particular, the state governments, many of them have banned the purchase of diesel buses from 2025 onwards. So there's a regulatory section there.
Yeah. That's good to hear that the fringe cases of economics are already there, and that perhaps the greater percentage of commercial cases are maybe 1 to 2 years away. I think, if I reflect on the hundreds of commercial solar projects that we've worked on, you could be idealistic and say that, these companies are making decisions on environmental factors and criteria. But, on the projects I've worked on, I could probably count on one hand how many have made an environmentally focused decision. It all has to stack up in a business case.
Yeah. And I'm going to say something controversial. But I actually think that in many ways, it has been a mistake to rely too heavily on the environmental reasons to transition fleets, because rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly, transition of fleets, the energy transition and climate action has become so political. It almost doesn't matter what the right answer is. It only matters what side you're on. And I hate that, because we all know the right answer, but in an environment when you're talking to someone and the right answer doesn't matter, then you're essentially just fighting a losing battle. And I was reflecting on this the other day when, someone again said to me, but did you see this report that electric vehicles are actually worse for the environment than petrol or diesel vehicles? And, I just turn around to them and say, well, why do you give a shit? Have you ever looked at the environmental benefits of petrol and diesel vehicles and said, well, that's why I'm buying a petrol or diesel vehicle? And I said, so why do you care? And they're like, just because, I'm being forced to switch to electric. So, I just want to show you that there's no reason to do that. And I said to them, so what you're saying to me is that if electric vehicles are actually better for you from your perspective, then you wouldn't have a problem, would you? And they said, but it's too expensive, it's, it's charging's a pain and blah, blah. I'm like, so hang on, let's just take that back a step. So if it was cheaper and charging was not a pain, would you buy an electric vehicle? They're like, yeah, well, of course. And so then I go, okay, well, let me show you all of the ways in which it is actually better for you that has nothing to do with the environment. I was like, if you don't care about the environment, believe that electric vehicles are more polluting. You'd probably be happier, right? But let me show you all the ways in which it is easier. And I have a similar conversation with fleets. I said, let's park the environmental parts for a second. This is about employee quality of life. If you're a tradie and you're in a diesel van all day, that is your workplace. And if you want your drivers in buses, trucks, and vans to have a better quality of life because it's a smoother ride, it's quieter, you get used to the rattle of a diesel engine. You do. Yeah. Right? And all you need to do is just to rent a van from GoGet and drive it around for a day to kind of quickly go, I don't even smell the diesel fumes at the end of the day. You get so used to it. But just because you get used to it doesn't mean it's good. And so if you talk to any bus driver of any electric bus, any truck driver of any electric truck, they'll tell you, I'm not going back. Are they not going back because they're environmental warriors? No, it's because they enjoy their job more. It's about OH&S. It's about the fact that they don't have to sniff those fumes, right? They have better air quality. It's about them not having to spend hours at the petrol station filling up a diesel tank, right? It's about being able to do that at home. It's about all of those things. And then once the cost gets there, well, the environmental side is just a bonus. And yes, we will romanticize in this industry and we will gloss things over. But when push comes to shove, very, very, very few people make decisions solely for environmental reasons against their own financial interest. It almost never happens. And so why do we want to keep fighting that losing battle? We don't. let's just focus on all the other good stuff, of which there are plenty. Buy the thing because it's better, not because it's better for the environment, just because it's better. And we always say within the business, Mother Nature doesn't give a shit why you do what you do. It just cares that you do it. Mm-hmm. And so we don't care if people don't have quote unquote pure intentions. We just care that they do it.
Yeah, I think that's particularly pertinent being on the sidelines of All Energy Conference, where the industry can so easily get sucked into the dialogue and the verbiage of environmentalism. And some people join this industry for all sorts of reasons, but if you're not careful, you find that you have to use that language and you have to use those terms to be in step with everyone else.
Yes.
It sort of becomes a bit cultish when there are many good reasons to be working on this tech, moving the needle, that don't have to necessarily be an ethical drive to make a difference for climate change. That can just be a benefit on the side.
I agree with that. And look, it is a drive for me now, but that's come through 10 years of education. And so, and like I'm a walking example of someone who can be educated and then be passionate about it afterwards. But yeah, I do think we do ourselves a disservice by putting like in the middle this kind of cult-like, as you just said, stance. And just rather, so many people buy solar and batteries. So many people buy solar at least because it's cheaper, right? And so, yeah, I don't think the kind of environmental movement as a whole, I think it's important, but I don't think it's the be-all and end-all in our industry.
So what are some of the things that excite you about the future of electric vehicles? There's obviously a lot of different concepts being floated about. I think, what the landscape looks like in 2 years will be far different from today, in 5 years, and 10 years. What makes you most excited about the future?
I mean, obviously I like the cars, and so I'm very excited about the cars. I think for JetCharge as a business, the thing that I'm most excited about is the ability for people who can least afford petrol costs and electricity costs to see them slashed down to almost zero. That is the thing that I dream about and I want to work towards. And, because at the end of the day, people live further away from the city, not because they necessarily want to. I mean, some people do, but because the price per square metre in an inner city block is ridiculous. They have to move further out if they want to raise their kids in an environment where you have a backyard, right? But in those further out areas, there's less public transport. So you have to drive. And so you end up paying more, like the people who end up paying more for petrol and diesel are the ones who can least afford it. And then on top of that, obviously, as a percentage of income, energy costs for those families are the highest, right? And so they can't afford the energy, they can't afford the transport bill, but they have to put up with it because they want to live somewhere where they'll be happy. The good thing about electric vehicles combined with solar, and we've modeled this, is the ability to slash both of those costs down by at least 70 to 80%, if not zero.
In 5-10 years' time, people looking at their vehicles differently. So at the moment, your vehicle's primary purpose, perhaps sole purpose, is to get you from A to B. And 95% of the time, it's either parked at work or it's parked in the garage. However, if you look at what a lot of these concepts are suggesting, and the vehicle is actually powering your home, perhaps performing services on the grid, which you get paid a revenue for, who's to say the primary purpose of a vehicle is actually changing towards being an income stream or a fundamental energy efficiency tool for a household instead of only being this,
depreciating asset.
We'll see them sold at Harvey Norman. So I completely agree with that. And again, it's just maths, right? So like we all know that we drive our cars 5 to 10% of the time, which means it's parked 90% of the time. And so we accept that. It has to be one of the only assets. I mean, maybe there are some other assets, but it must be one of the only assets where we pay full retail price to utilise it 5% of the time. And so in a world where every time you're parked, it is doing something from an energy perspective, whether it be taking your solar, whether it be playing on the national market, whether it be doing whatever. If it is doing that the other time, 90% of the time, then mathematically, that vehicle is primarily an energy asset, not an automotive asset.
It's such a significant shift in thinking, though, and it's one that will take... It will take a generation of having bidirectional electricity use before that really starts to sink in.
Oh, I completely agree with that. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I do think like we are now in the land of like conjecture but the reality is there. How people perceive it is going to be different. And they'll be different between consumers and businesses. For businesses, I've seen so many business cases where bus, truck, and fleet operators have been pitched, oh, this is going to be a huge battery asset. You should bid it onto the grid. You should do. I'm like, dude, like, let them run their fleet first, right? The transitioning to electric vehicles is hard enough. Like, let them run their fleet first. Once that's stable, then let's talk about all the other stuff. Because for the fleets, it is a transport asset, right? Yeah. Like, you need to pick your kids up from school in a bus. You need to drive for work. Like, that is actually an asset. But for consumers, it is very different. And that kind of depreciating asset, like we've just taken it as given. The depreciation on most cars is pretty bad, but we've said that's okay, right? But as soon as it's being used for an energy asset and you'll see your electricity bills really go to zero every day, holy crap, like I just think people will get very excited. It is a huge amount of money transfer back to consumers. So I think we will not only see a change in terms of how people view their vehicles, I think we will also see, at least in the consumer space, a complete rethink of how consumers are actually charged for the upkeep of the grid.
We're probably getting pretty close to the end of the time we have together. So maybe one last question. If you're looking back, what's something that you're most proud of?
Oh, wow. So many things. To take, I think, a really politically correct answer, but one that is true, seeing the development of a lot of members of our team go from people who just started to being one of the experts in the industry has been incredibly rewarding. At the end of the day, what are companies but just a group of people trying to do something, right? And to see some of the progress that some of the people have made, both within this business and then go on to do much better things as well, has been awesome. If I'm thinking about a business achievement, I think two things. The first is building the third 350 kilowatt charging network in the world through ChargeFox. When that first charging station got built in Euroa in Victoria, and I stood there and I watched the ground mount solar from 5B, the battery storage from ABB, and the chargers from ABB, and then Tritium at that time. And despite all of the issues that have happened since then with all of various brands, just to stand there and go, we built something, so cool. Because as a lawyer, you do contracts, it's all in the computer, right? But just to be able to stand next to something, go, we built that and people are using it, and that's awesome. And so I was really, really proud of that. And then that moment also hit me the first time I went to this site in Canberra, where we did the V2G trial, and there's a row of 10 V2G charging stations plugged into 10 Nissan Leafs as part of the ACT government fleet. And I stood there and I was like, this is actually a peek into what's going to happen in the future. This is it. And we built it, and we are we ran the largest FCAS fleet trial in the world at that stage, and we were only the second country behind the UK in working with Wallbox on that Quasar system for so many years. I was so proud of that. And I think ultimately, again, humans are visual people. You do standing there, seeing the result of so many months and sometimes years of planning, you can't help but be proud of what you've built. And I think it's those physical things that bring me daily joy. I think if I were, as I said to the team, if I was stuck behind a computer all day looking at Excel spreadsheets, that would have been the end of my journey at JetCharge. They let me play with things because they know that's what makes me happy. But, there are lots of people who will listen to your podcast, who will install panels and who will install batteries and do all of those things. And I think sometimes when you're doing so many of those every day, every week, when you're relying on that to survive and you see it more as a chore, you tend to forget that you're part of the greatest transition in energy in human history, or some of the greatest, and that this opportunity will never come around again, and that the urgency has never been greater. And yes, we are one person, one company in what is a global race to decarbonize, but efforts matter, and you could be making efforts doing evil shit, or you could be making efforts doing good stuff, and it feels good to be a good guy.
And on that note, we'll probably wrap it up, but thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you coming in to have a chat, and we'll keep an eye out for all the exciting things happening at JetCharge over the next, 1 to 10, 200 years, you said.
Yeah.
Thanks,
awesome.
Tim.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks.
So that's it, and thanks for listening to episode 1 of the EV Charging Podcast presented by Solar Choice, Australia's only instant quote comparison service for EV chargers, solar, heat pumps and batteries. We also provide independent consultation and tender management for clean energy projects in the commercial and strata sector, with over 17 years of experience and a wealth of in-house expertise. Find out more at our websites at solarchoice.net.au and stay tuned for the next episode in 2 weeks.
And if you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review on your favourite podcast app and make sure you share the episode with someone else who might enjoy it too. See you next time.